I V M.
We are here to remind you to pay your credit card bills because paying on time is a good policy. Credit Power Play gives you a chance to win 100% cashback during the first 6 overs of both innings of any IPL match. Just pay your credit card bill and stand to win 100% cashback. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kevagamani, and today I have with me my colleague Rohan Seth, and we are going to be talking about the recent developments in China's technology ecosystem. Over the last few days, there's been sort of a shockwave across the entire tech ecosystem with the central government essentially talking about restructuring the entire platform economy in the country. There were lots of signs that this was coming. But in the past few months, people were still talking about, well, this might be a personal campaign against Jack Ma and Alibaba and Ant Financial. But what we are learning right now is that this is really not a personal campaign. And Rohan, if you recall, we had spoken about how this is not a personal campaign. You can't divorce personality in such an ecosystem, but there is much more deeper stuff that's going on in terms of the Chinese regulatory environment with regards to platform economics. So Rohan and I are going to be talking about that. Rohan, welcome to this conversation.
Hello.
So Rohan, let's begin with what's happened with Ant Group. So Ant Group, one of the biggest payment products in the company, one of the biggest sort of companies hosting the Alipay app, which had more than 700 million monthly users in China, one of the biggest sort of payment platforms in the country. It's been in the crosshairs of the regulators at least since late October, which is when, if you remember, Jack Ma had given a speech, and the Ant Group IPO, which was some 35 odd billion, it was estimated to be at, was abruptly halted. And then there was lots of reportage about Jack Ma having vanished and then having reappeared, and the regulators sort of pushing Alibaba to restructure, and there was all that sort of murky talk. And now we have some sort of clarity. So Rohan, first let me just tell us what have you read about what's happening with Ant Group.
So the Ant Group's super interesting. Let me sort of pivot this question back to you in some sense, because when the IPO for this thing was supposed to go out, it was supposed to be absolutely mammoth, right? It was supposed to be one of the biggest tech IPOs I think China's ever seen. And what ends up happening is that the state then tells Ant that you can't basically have all of the let's say this in the dietary terms that I've been recently following. You can't have all the protein of a bank without having any of the carbs, which is that you can't have all the assets of all the perks of being a bank without actually having the compliance liabilities, and that's why that thing was halted. And that to me sounds like a pretty proactive way to approach tech regulation. You tell me if I've got this wrong, but is my reading of the situation correct?
So in some ways, yes. I mean, essentially that was the argument that the regulators made. And they basically said that, look, you're doing so much of this lending. You were not putting any of your money involved in there. You're making money on commissions and fees. But, and you're facilitating all this lending, and you're sort of this middleman between the banks and lenders and, private individuals and enterprises and so on and so forth. And it's really billions of dollars worth of transactions that are taking place. And if you want to be in this game and you're acting as a financial entity, then you need to come under the same sort of scrutiny that other lending institutions come under. Because you can't be behaving like a financial institution and not have that same scrutiny, because there is tremendous risk involved with what lending you're doing. So unless you put greater money in there as security and you take a part in that process, there's no way that we can let you continue doing this. And Ant Financial's argument, Ant Group's argument essentially was just like what other tech companies were saying at that point of time, which was that, look, we are essentially a technology company, we are not a financial company. And therefore, the regulation that should be according to us should be of technology companies and not of financial institutions. And that was the sort of push and pull from a regulatory point of view. Now, like I said, there was also this personality issue, right? There's lots of talk about how Jack Ma has a certain charisma, and in a speech to before sort of senior officials at an event in Shanghai in October, he'd made a comment about Chinese regulators having this pawn shop mentality where you sort of mortgage something, put a little bit, and you're not thinking about the broader picture or how these payment platforms have completely lending and payment platforms have completely revolutionized the country, and so on and so forth. And he's very sarcastic. He quotes Xi Jinping in that speech to make a point. And there are senior regulators sitting over there, and it obviously pisses them off. And I mean, at least on the reporting that we heard at that point in time, the Wall Street Journal reported this, and I remember we discussed this. Xi Jinping then sort of personally took charge of this particular project of saying, okay, let's bring them to heel. Let's push forward with this regulation that we've been talking for some time. And they issue these new rules in late October. Ant's IPO is put on hold, and then regulators sort of are sitting in Ant's offices and they're talking about restructuring the company because they're like, look, this is the regulation. Let's look at your books and start figuring things out. So there's a little bit of that going on. So you do, and the argument in theory does make sense, right? I mean, you are a financial entity. You are putting in billions of dollars of transactions that are going through you. And there's lots of risk that is created because of these transactions. You're not assuming any risk. And it all comes back to the banking system, which eventually comes back to the government. So the issue is also not that the banking system may fail, and that may be a case of, a private bank failing and whatever the challenges of that coming up. But the case in China is that when the banking system collapses, it can be a domino effect, which can lead to political instability for the party. So there's that entire sort of risk architecture that you keep in mind, and that's what sort of began all of this.
Also, I feel compelled to add here that the ownership is also really interesting of the Ant Group and Alibaba itself, because they are, of course, separate entities. And if you just look at Alibaba's sort of top five shareholders, you'll see SoftBank up there. I think they've got a checkered history, Alibaba, in terms of their shareholders. You've had Yahoo being an investor before and so on. But like SoftBank owns 25% of Alibaba. And then you've got Ant Financial, where Jack Ma owns 33%, and he's, of course, a huge shareholder. But generally, I feel like Ant Financial seems to be the money making machine, and Jack Ma seems to have a lot of control over that. And I feel like that's why it's an interesting situation to be in. I think you'll be able to explain better the role Ant has to play in terms of being China's Paytm and so on. But I don't think
Yeah,
we really want this conversation to go.
yeah, no, it's huge. It's a huge entity. I've already said, right? I mean, 700 billion users, tremendous number of transactions. So it's a huge entity. And the IPO was going to be valued at something like 35 billion US dollars. So again, lots of money, huge entity with massive market penetration, and therefore much greater risk from the party's point of view. I mean, let's fast forward to sort of what's happened in the last few days. And I know that you've been reading about this, and I've been reading about this. To me, anybody who sort of thought that, some of the changes that we are seeing right now in terms of antitrust action would not happen, and this was simply about personality and Jack Ma. And again, I'm not ruling out the personality angle. I think it exists because Jack Ma has a institute, a school for sort of CEOs sort of thing. And there were reports recently in the last week, the Financial Times reporting that, uh, there's been some effort to try and crack down on people joining that school. And the idea is that you see a place where you can create a group with alternative ideas and a group with money and power with alternative ideas that can challenge the party's legitimacy. And then therefore trying to crack down on that. So again, so there is a certain bit of personality involved in all this. But I think in the last few days, what we've seen very clearly that this is much more than personality. On Saturday, there was a fine imposed on Ant Group, and it was quite a significant fine, right? And the idea was that this is because of their, you know, monopolistic practices. And soon after that, we saw Ant Group sort of coming out very quickly to acknowledge this. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this, right? What is your take on the idea that this fine was imposed, and it sets a precedent in some way, not just in China but even in other places, that such a massive fine has been imposed on a company.
Yeah, I think I have a lot to say here, uncharacteristically. I think so. The state administration for market regulation slapped a $2.8 billion fine on Alibaba, right? And few things happened then. The fine was slapped on Saturday. Alibaba's stock shoots up on Monday by 8%. And for some reason, and maybe this is not a direct correlation, but this is seen in the market as a win for Alibaba. And I personally draw some parallels to that FTC fine that was levied on Facebook for 5 billion in 2019. So there are some parallels that I would like to explore more over there. But the more interesting thing, and sort of maybe to some extent expected, was that the penalty decision, it notes that Alibaba waived its right to make statements, arguments, or even to request a hearing. And there are two major orders that come out of this, right? So, firstly, I think there's a big compliance thing that needs to happen, which is that Alibaba will not restrict operators in the platform to operate in other competitive platforms. It shall also not restrict operators in the platform to promote their activity in other competitive platforms. They give Alibaba 15 days to implement this. This, in some sense, to me, seems like enabling more competition in the e-commerce ecosystem. I am not sure who the other e-commerce giants are, Manoj. So if you can help me out with names, but I think they should generally be thankful, right? Uh, Also, there is a lot of rectification that has been asked for Alibaba here. There is a lot of responsibility that they need to take up from now on. This means strengthening internal control, compliance management, protecting the rights and interests of consumers in accordance with the law. I don't know what Chinese consumer protection standards are, but let me give it a shot. Which is like you've got to, as a platform, Alibaba's got to conduct an examination of itself against the anti-monopoly law and regulate business conduct. It shouldn't abuse its dominant position in the market. It should improve a bunch of practices and policies according to the law. This includes service agreements, platform operations, resource management, internet traffic distribution, other transaction rules. It should set up an objective and neutral search. It should sort out all its other algorithms, use data resources in a fair and impartial way, quote unquote, effectively improve the openness and transparency of platforms' governance rules, and also protect individual information and privacy. And that is sort of the compliance mandate that the SAMR has come up with. And it it is asking for a report by April 30th, then asking for reports on December 31st of 21, 2022, and 2023. And that just seems to me like a lot of control has been ceded away from Alibaba. And in a lot of areas, I think in how they treat their operators, in how they treat their data, how they treat their search, and generally just how their platform is governed. So it seems to be like a major crackdown. We can get into the relevant market later, but that's my basic reading of this.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I think it's a big crackdown, and it's sort of, I mean, when one read the statement that Alibaba put out over the last few days on its WeChat account, it talks about how this has been in the works since late December. The statement says that on 26 December 2020, regulators put forward 5 requirements to Ant Group for the rectification of its key businesses. And it says that Ant attaches great importance to the seriousness of the rectification, and it sort of agreed with everything and said that we will be completing the formulation of our rectification plan and then carrying it out. So essentially, one big component of this, and this was again reported by Wall Street Journal quite some time ago, that this is in the works, that Ant Group would be reconstituted as a financial holding company. So its businesses would change significantly. There would be a pivot in the focus towards just serving individual consumers and small and medium enterprises by focusing on micro payments. So again, there's a certain cap in terms of what kind of payments you're going to focus on. They'll be setting up a personal credit reporting company. Different products would be operated by different entities. So there's a full sort of change that's taking place. And along with that, I'm going to read out some components of that statement. Alibaba said that, we will enhance, like you said, our corporate governance, adhere to fair competition rules, whether it's related to transactions, strengthen risk prevention and control. We will also work for healthy and orderly development of the industry, which sort of covers some of the things that you spoke about, right? Some of these activities that they said that they should not be doing, like the nature of the search, which may be biased, the nature of limiting competition for certain products on on your platform, allow putting pressure on sellers to choose between your platform and another platform, and therefore make creating a monopoly on your own platform by leveraging your dominant market position. One of the sort of key sentences in Alibaba's statement is, "We will put our growth proactively within the national strategic context." This is again something that the party has been wanting tech companies to do, is to start pivoting away from necessarily just making money, but to make money and in order to serve what are the broader strategic interests that it identifies. And that's, I think, something that's key, because this is a significant shift from the age-old dictum of Deng Xiaoping, which has sort of supported Chinese development and growth over the years, which talked about being rich and about how being rich is glorious. And this is now changing, right? It's not just about being rich and making money, but it's also about servicing the strategic needs of the state. And they talk about all of that. At the same time, I was reading in yesterday, there was an interview with a senior People's Bank of China official, Pan Dongsheng, and he talks about how going forward, he outlined the sort of plan that they have with Alibaba, and then he sort of talks about what is going to happen across the board. And he talks about how platform companies should be serving the real economy and preventing financial risks, and should not use the excuse of them being technology companies as a camouflage for what he said were illegal activities. He says all financial activities should fall under financial supervision. So nobody can sort of make that argument that, oh, we are fintechs, but we are tech and not really financial. And then he talked about how, despite all of this and what they are doing, their goal is to make sure that there are standards that everybody follows, that there is no monopoly development, and at the same time, you support private companies in making money. So again, that goes back to the broad argument that I was talking about, where the state wants, the wants private entities to grow, but grow in the direction that it wants them to grow, and not for them to chase revenues, which is significantly different from something than what should happen normally, because the idea should be that private capital chases returns, and based on the returns it generates value in society, and that's not happening. And lo and behold, just a day later, yesterday in the evening, sorry, we learned that you know uh, the regulators, the State Administration for Market Regulation, which is a key regulator, the Central Cyberspace Administration, and the State Administration of Taxation, met with representatives of 34 technology companies, 34 platform companies. These include entities like Meituan, Tencent, JD, DD, all of these guys who provide different services, from food delivery, food tech, so to uh, Uber-like services of cab, to of course Tencent, which is much broader, to e-commerce and so on and so forth. And it's basically told them that you need to take this example of Alibaba as a warning, and it gave them all a month to come up with their own rectification plans. This is an interesting statement that they issued after this particular meeting, where they said that they intend to, quote, establish a new order for platform economy, which again is they're basically saying that we want to change the way things are done, which is, like I said, much more than just one individual, this being about one individual. And they laid out five what are called strict preventions in order to ensure five ensures. And this is strictly prevent disorderly expansion of capital to ensure economic and social security, strictly prevent monopoly and ensure fair market competition, strictly prevent the bottlenecking or the strangulation of technology in order to ensure greater innovation, strictly prevent the abuse of algorithms that infringe on people's legal rights. So, tailored searches and that sort of stuff. And lastly, strictly prevent the use of closed systems to ensure the development of open and shared systems. So, idea is that you don't sort of lock people in your ecosystem, but actually, there should be interoperability between different systems. Again, this will mean a complete and wholesale change. And I know you understand technology much better than I do, but this to me suggests like you're basically rewiring and restructuring the entire industry.
So I think that there is an underlying sort of I don't know how to explain this, but there is an underlying current here, which to me seems like everything that China is doing, there is a parallel, I wouldn't, maybe an alternate reality in the West, where everything else is also taking place at its own speed. I think the US is taking antitrust in its own way. So, for example, in the US, antitrust is approached, and this is a very basic statement without a lot of nuance. But the way antitrust in the US is approached is by saying that, well, you're a big company, you have broken X law, which is why you will be subject to X fine or X remedial action. Right? In the EU, generally they take action by saying, listen, the nature of this market itself is such that concentration of power happens between one or two companies, right? So we need to change the very nature of the market to make sure that this thing is structurally fixed.
Mm.
What China seems to be doing, and I must admit, I don't actively follow all of this, but this seems to me like a bit of a hybrid. Which, what I mean by that is, they're penalizing Alibaba, and then they're later saying that, listen, also this whole thing seems to be structured in a way that is currently not serving the needs of the state, and we are going to change that to make it so. Have I gotten this broad principle
Yeah,
right? Right?
yeah,
Okay. Having said that, I feel like the way they're going to do this is sort of similar to how anti-monopolies have generally been treated. What I mean by that is that when you look at, let's say, a competition case or whatever, if you look at a Competition Commission of India order, if you look at a US Congress order, there's a very set process that is followed to look at to look at competition law, which is, you define a market, you say that the player is dominant in the market, and then generally you say that this player has used its leverage in one market to abuse its dominance in the other market. This is basically the playbook that's followed, right? And this is also the case in China. So
mm,
this is the first step where they talk about defining the relevant market. And Alibaba says that its relevant market is business to consumer, right? Online retailing platform market or so on. I don't know the Chinese terminologies. They have basically gone with online retailing platform market, which is interesting because the state authority, is actually arguing that instead of looking at business to consumer, you should look at both B2C and C2C, which is consumer to consumer and business to consumer. So, in the very basic layman sense, it's saying you are Amazon and eBay,
yeah,
right? And generally, what I have seen in monopoly cases is that you would have the regulator define the market very narrowly. So, for example, I don't know, a regulator will say to Facebook, just as a random company, that you are dominant in a social media space. So Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp are too big, and you don't have enough competition in Reddit and Twitter. So,
mm,
and Facebook will say, I'm in the market for attention, which means that I am competing with Netflix, I'm competing with YouTube, I'm also competing with these five other social media companies. Right?
yeah,
Here, that script is flipped on its head from my initial reading, because the regulator is arguing that you are in both these markets, and Alibaba is arguing I'm only in one market.
yeah.
And it is staggering to me that you have to basically make the case in China that there are these two huge markets, and you are equally, or I don't know, equally dominant in both of them. And I think this just goes to say that Alibaba's position, I haven't seen a lot of precedent for it, because the regulators actually trying to expand the market, and the alleged monopolist is not. But just going by that, I and I think you will be able to answer this better than I can. But does this mean that there is, maybe instead of a structural change, is a breakup in the works? I can't. I think that's a leap I am not comfortable making. But maybe you have better context than I do. Do you think a breakup might be coming?
I mean, I think that there is. I'm anticipating some sort of a breakup of different entities, and I think that there is some, particularly with regard to their lending and financial sort of payments and lending aspects of the business, right? Because I have a feeling, and I think I read this also about a week ago, that JD, which is another big e-commerce platform, is also looking to sort of constitute a separate financial holding company. So I think there is a certain, and this has largely to do with financial risk, given, like I explained, the nature of political, the political sort of aspect of financial risk in China and how grave that can be from the party's point of view. In that sense, it seems to me like there will be certain amounts of a breakup where companies will be asked to restructure so that their financial operations come under what is the standard financial supervision and regulation. The rest of it, where you're talking about certain kinds of red lines that the regulators have identified, things like forcing a merchant to only pick one platform, or making hostile bids uh, to acquire top players in specific market segments and therefore creating monopolies. Now that again is challenging, right? How do you define what's a hostile bid? How do you sort of enter these different markets that you're talking about? Misusing data and all that. To me, those are going to be case by case basis, which don't lead to structural changes. Those will lead to fines, certain kinds of regulatory action, legal issues over a period of time. But structurally, what is going to change is the financial business part of all of this, which is huge, will be constituted separately for most of these entities who are engaged in some of this work. And the rest of it will continue as it is, but there will be far more caution because you will be far more open to intervention from the state at any point of time. So there will be far more caution in how you do your business. To me, those are the two sort of things in terms of how the restructuring will take place. Now, whether and how the state directs, and this is something that we have to keep an eye on, right? When they're saying that, adhere to the priority of national interests, how the state restructures that engagement and what it defines as strategic interests, and where it then directs the money and what it then creates is something that we need to see. To me, that might be the other sort of aspect of all of this, of how the ecosystem grows. And that may see some of these guys putting money in spaces where they would ideally have not. It's no longer a free business decision. It's not, sorry, it's not even a free, it's no longer a business decision. It's a political decision. So it's not driven by that motive. So these are the sort of three things where I'd see, right? At one level, uh, finance related businesses and aspects will be separated, and they will be regulated separately. uh, Core business or the core market, whether it's e-commerce, whether it's something else, will operate as it is with greater restrictions, or greater intervention, with along with greater legislative action and regulatory supervision. And the third aspect will be, where does this national interest business fit in, and where does that direct money for these entities is a third, and how that then impacts the rest of their businesses. Because if you can't reinvest in making money, but you have to reinvest in making some of your money in, where the government wants you to, which can be which can lead to suboptimal outcomes. Then what happens to the health of your entire technology system? So that's how I see this.
And so I must confess, I have a tiny follow up, which is that when I think about, let's say, breakup in the American context, so for example, in Facebook, I'd say break it up into Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. Apple break it up into wearables, and the App Store, and the rest. Right. So there's basically, to some extent, some defined lines along which you are going to break up a company. Maybe not so much in the case of Google, but like in the case of Amazon, I could say break up AWS and the platform and so on. In the case of Alibaba, how do you go about it? Are there predefined lines that people might have in mind, or is this just going to be a messy breakup that in the name of national interest we'll have to go through regardless of what the cost is?
No, I think if you see the statement, they have given us an indication of what sort of breakups they are going to do. There are different products and different entities or different services, and those are being treated separately. So there is, and I don't want to go into these individual services because that is going to complicate the entire conversation for people who may not be familiar with it. Because in India, we don't use any of this, but each of these different services are going to be treated separately by and large. So that degree of breakup is happening, but it's all related to payments and lending. It's not necessarily related to the core sort of T-mall business or things like that.
I think it's safe to say that we are going into extremely interesting times as far as the Chinese tech ecosystem is concerned, not least because in some ways, China is going to be the leader in regulating this just judging by the pace of how this is progressing there and how it's progressing in the US/EU. Um, I I honestly cannot wait to see how this thing ends up evolving.
Yeah, we're entering uncharted territories in many which ways, and I think it's going to be interesting to just keep an eye on how this develops going forward. Because, like you said, Rohan, this is going to tell us a little bit about what can become potentially acceptable practice also. And again, it's fascinating to hear how different the US, Europe have looked at regulation with regard to monopolies, and how the Chinese are sort of developing this hybrid model. I guess it's a space that we all need to watch going forward. All right, with that, we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much, Rohan.
Thank you.
The Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. We have education programs lasting 1 semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. They are all online and you can take them from anywhere. Admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology policy, and health and life sciences. Visit takshashila.org.in/courses to find out more. If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, Siet Tires and thewholetruthfoods.com. So this week on Advertising is Dead, Varun was joined by Mansi Zaveri. She shares her experience of running a community for parents of young kids and teenagers and of hosting a podcast along the same lines. Gauri Devidayal was joined by Divya Thani on This Round is on Me. Divya works as a global editorial director with Condé Nast Traveler. They discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of a travel writer's job. On Candid Kanan, Sid is in conversation with Adarsh Gaurav, who recently scored a BAFTA nomination for his role in the Netflix adaptation of The White Tiger. They talk about his role in the show, life pre and post-stardom, and so much more. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ritash and Ayushi talk about the precious time and opportunities lost to the lockdown and share their post-COVID wish list. When it comes to cricket this season, we have you covered. In English, we have Edges and Sledges, which do their show live on YouTube. They look for announcements over there. And for our Hindi listeners, we have Khel Niti, hosted by Rajiv Mishra and ex-Indian cricketer Sabah Kareem. This show is live streamed on YouTube every day at 9:15. Definitely do check these out and hope to see you again next week.
If you love cricket, listen up. The Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast is here for you. Hosted by DJ, Varun, and me, Ashwin, we bring a fun, fresh fan's point of view to talking all things cricket. Sometimes it's just the three of us, sometimes we have guests, including current and former international cricketers. For new episodes every week, check out the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast on the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts.